So good afternoon. Welcome to this session. So my name is José Ricardo Aguilar. I am part of the team of Instituto Pedro Nunes in Coimbra, a private non-profit association for R&D, applied research, and business incubation. I am part of the innovation team. And as a brief note of introduction, I will just share this slide with you. So my background is in law. I'm a lawyer, and I work in this field of IP since 2002. I am also invited lecturer near the Faculty of Pharmacy of the University of Coimbra, and I am part of some boards regarding IP near EARTO, the IP, European Union IP Office, and also near the European Patent Office. So I work in this field since 2002, for a long time now. Providing support to innovators, to entrepreneurs, to researchers, to people from the university. So I am quite used to deliver this kind of training to non-lawyers, in fact. So my basic experience has to do with delivering some talks on this topic to engineers, to scientists, to people with scientific backgrounds, and not to lawyers. And that's why I think I can manage a very practical and direct approach to this topic, and I hope this will be the case this time. So here is our structure for today. So we'll begin with some fundamentals on IP, because I always have this thought about this not being the most developed topic. So people tend to know one or two things about this, but not a very structured knowledge about this topic. So making this kind of roadmap of the available IP rights, then showing some cross examples of IP protection, especially with very familiar objects that we use, and to see and to develop one very fundamental idea about how to protect the project, or how to protect the technology. Then we'll focus, as we have here, lots of software projects. Of course, we will see more in detail the protection of software creations using IP, especially with this idea of core protection and side protection. So using the whole range of IP rights in order to try to protect them. And also looking closely to the different models of licensing, especially putting in the right perspective all the reality of open source models in comparison with the more property or licensing models with regard to software. In the end, we'll briefly address the topic of commercial exploitation of technologies, making some very, very practical advice on this field. So why an IP module, in fact? I already mentioned that we, during all these years, we have this very concrete idea that these topics are not well developed, especially near those scientific fields and publics. In fact, this is a topic, can talk about the Portuguese experience, but also the experience in other countries, especially in Europe. People tend to know some things about and have some generic ideas about IP, but they lack some more in-depth knowledge, and to mobilize some requisites, some points that are crucial in an early stage phase in order to secure the intellectual assets that are being developed. When we think about an innovative project, and we can of course think about things that are very, very high, sophisticated, high-tech projects, but also think about low-tech solutions or objects or something. In every case, it's important to know some basic concepts in order to secure the basic aspects that we mobilize for our project. And this is a very strong idea that I would like to pass through this session. Of course, when we think about creation, innovation, about inventing something, we think about blood, sweat, and tears, as we say here. So people normally will need to use a great amount of time and sometimes other resources in order to mobilize them to create something new. in the majority of cases, in fact, we are also thinking about teamwork and not that single inventor that works in a garage, for instance. Normally, we think about people gathered to develop and to perform with their mixed competences and skills well-defined project. Of course, this will bring us to costs. So time costs, but also, of course, material costs, money, resources, labs, and so on, computers, internet, and lots of things that we need to mobilize in order to take to carry on the project. In that sense, and during all this experience, and of course I'm sure that you are aware of this, we need to try, we need to fail, we need to follow some paths that in the end will not bring us anything. So in that sense, all that time is the time and the cost that we have to have something new. And in fact, if we do not care, if we don't care about protection, what can happen is that someone around us, someone more aggressive, with less ethics, with a lesser degree of ethics, can steal things from us and can take things away from us, can copy our work and get immediately to the market and take this immediate competitive advantage with him. And with all this, you will surpass us and we'll go through all this phase of development without spending one single cent sometimes. That cost will remain with us and that cost will be lost from our side. We will not be able to take our appropriate reward from our investment if we do not take care about protection. And that's why we have this bundle of intellectual property rights. And these rights, which are reviewed in the law, national laws, but also international laws, and in fact quite stable all around the globe, the majority of the economic spaces. So with regard to these IP rights, they will provide us legal protection for our creations, for intellectual creations. And we can think about creations of different kinds in this sense. These IP rights will provide us with an exclusive, with a monopoly, with the right to exclude third parties from the exploitation of those assets that are protected. And of course, it will entitle the owner of these rights to ask for a payment for the exploitation of those rights. So this is the generic concept, which is the framework for all the IP rights. And then we'll go through them quite quickly, of course, because we are short on time today, but we'll go quickly through them and we'll see that this is like the most generic way of defining IP rights. So looking at them, looking at those IP rights, we can use them to protect different things. And we have here a very wide range of examples. We have Segway. We have this very curious example in the middle, in the top, so top middle, which is jelly, which is packed in something that reminds the paintings, so the oils for paintings. So a very different approach with regard to innovation regarding the packaging of this kind of food, so jellies. Then the famous orange crusher from Philip Stark on the top right. Then we have a trademark here, Shell. Then we have the wearable iWatch from Apple, and we have source code as software itself. So as you see here, we have different examples of innovation which are related with different dimensions of creation and intellectual development. As we see here, we have very different things. One of our first concerns when we have meetings, as I told you in the beginning, we are part of the team that supports the creation of startups and new projects. And we have one particular example of a great project here just after these slides. One of the first things that we notice when we have meetings with innovators, with inventors, and so on, is that sometimes they bring us this dilemma. They say, well, I want to protect my idea. And looking to our previous slide, we saw that we have different ways of protecting intellectual creations, but in fact, it is very hard to have a monopoly on a single idea, on a wide concept. And we have here 3 examples to understand this. First one on top was the mid-90s in Portugal. We had the first experience, I think, ever, a global experience, a world premiere in Portugal, which was the prepaid phones, mobile phones. So those mobile phones that you could add credit for making phone calls using your ATM machine and converting money immediately into credits or minutes credits for making your phone calls. The second example is a social network, and we have here Facebook, the most famous one. And then on the bottom, we have a third example, which is an app that runs on a tablet to show you the wine list in a restaurant. So the common point of these 3 cases is that in all of them, the first creator, the first one that developed these 3 ideas, prepaid phones, social network, and an app to show wine lists, to assure a monopoly when we think about broad ideas. What we can do, in fact, is that we can protect certain and concrete features, aspects, dimensions of a given idea or concept. And getting back to them, when we see the first case, we have clearly here technicalities, and they can be protected using one single IP right, and you'll see them afterwards. We have trademarks, of course, and trademarks are, of course, one of the most critical assets, for instance, for a social network, but for a service based on the internet, on the web. With regard to the app, we have also a way of protecting its layout, but not the generic concept. So in this sense, it's important, and our first idea is that we need to look at a single project and see and pick from the list of IP rights which ones, and sometimes more than one, in fact, can be mobilized to protect our idea. Okay? And that's why when we think about ideas, we are on our left side, so we are on that brainware, on that concept phase, and that concept phase is materialized sometimes. It is disclosed, of course, it is put into practice, and it is materialized. Documents, in writing, drawings, in processes, in flow charts, schemes, data, whatever, or creation of statical creation, for instance, looking to copyrights, for instance. And there is the point when we can use the IP rights to protect those ways of putting into some concrete way our creations. And the concrete way, I'm not mentioning, of course, building things, turning them into tangible assets, but looking at things that our senses can mobilize, can see what they are. When we look at that, and when we get in from the basic concept to those different angles of that concept, of that project, then we are ready to use the IP rights. And which IP rights can we use? Well, in fact, we have 2 big families of IP rights. So intellectual property rights are divided into industrial property rights from one side and copyright on the other side. So with regard to industrial property rights, we have the protection of technical features, namely inventions. So a technical solution for a given technical problem. And we can use patents, patent applications, and utility models. Then the protection of the distinctive character of a sign, of a given sign, of a brand. You can do that using another IP right, which is a different one called trademark. very well-known, famous one, the most famous one. And then we can also protect the design, the external appearance of a given object using a design right. So these are the three main areas of protection that we can use with regard to industrial property rights. These are a family of rights which are present in the majority of the legislations worldwide, in different countries, and part of them also in international treaties that will provide you the chance to extend the protection to other territories, to a group of territories, so reaching a kind of global protection in that sense. And these rights can be used only if you apply for registration. And this is a very important point. You can only have protection for technical features, namely inventions, for the distinctive character of science, and for design, if you apply for that protection. So if you apply to a public authority to grant you that right. Getting back to this slide, we have the second family, which is called copyright. And copyright has to do with more aesthetical and the creative creations of the human mind, but also with the protection of software as such in the majority of countries, especially in Europe, in the continental Europe countries. We think about Germany, France, Italy, for instance, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and so on. So they are all sharing this basic concept of protection of software being granted by copyright. So this is a very important topic, especially having in mind the nature of the projects and the people that are gathered here in this session, of course, and that are gathered in this EOSC project. So, first of all, thinking about patents, patent is a title granted to an invention, as I told you, a novel technical solution for a given technical problem, which is granted by a public authority, National Patent and Trademark Office, or international organization, for instance, the very famous and important European Patent Office, with a time span of 20 years since the first filing date. And after that period, that invention turns into public domain, so no one can block that again as a monopoly by itself or as a group of people. And this will, of course, bring the right of exploitation of an invention, regardless of being a product, a process, or sometimes a method as well, for, as I told you, a novel technical solution for a given technical problem. And we can only think about patents if we have this: a problem, an identified problem, and then a technical solution to tackle that problem. So this is the basic equation for you to obtain protection with regard to patents. Utility models are another IP right, which is defined in some of the IP internal laws for the protection of small inventions. So small projects and small technical improvements in that sense. So the requisites for patentability, and this is one point which is very, very important. There are three: novelty, inventive step, and industrial application. So you can only have the protection of an invention, first of all, if that invention is novel, which means that at our filing date, at the date where we reach the office and file our patent application, that invention must not be known or already disclosed to the public by yourself as an inventor or as the applicant or by any third party. So it is very, very important to know that if you ever want to patent something, you should not disclose it prior to that date. The first thing that you do in public should be the patent application. Otherwise, in Europe, your patent can be refused due to the lack of novelty. So this is something that any researcher, any inventor, any innovator that wants to grant a monopoly, to have a monopoly to an invention, must know in order to avoid the fatal error of disclosing everything and then trying to patent afterwards. That's not the right order, in fact. You need first to apply for the patent, and then you can disclose it. That's the proper order. And that's the order that our European Patent Office, for instance, will ask you to obey in order to grant you protection. Then there's a second requisite, which is the inventive step. So any patent application is observed, is analyzed by a pair. What I want to say is that if you are patenting something with regard to software, a software engineer, sometimes a guy with a PhD degree or something, which is part of the staff of the patent office, will assess not only the novelty, so checking everything that was disclosed near to that area, but also if that invention is obvious with regard to all the given prior art, or if, in the opposite way, is something which is non-obvious and is a surprising approach. So this is very hard to overcome, because on the other side, you have someone which is a very high skilled person in the art, especially because these guys normally they work in very close fields of technical fields. And then they must be surprised with your approach to the problem. They must address the problem. They must know which problem do you want to solve with your invention. And then they must be convinced with your patent specification that your solution is not only novel, but non-obvious. And that's very hard to overcome, as I told you. The third requisite is a very simple one, which is the need for the invention to have an industrial application. So it should be prone to be replicated, reproducible, departing from the patent specification. So not depending from any, how can we say, any specific skill, human skill of a given person. So anyone that works in the field must be entitled with that, reading that patent specification to understand, not only to understand, but also to perform that invention. So it's quite easy, this one, to overcome. Once the patent is granted, and this is a very lengthy process, it can take you 3-4 years, the patent confers to the owner the right to prevent any other entity from commercially exploiting the invention. So this is that idea of monopoly that I already mentioned. This right is limited in time, so normally 20 years, and also limited to the territories that we designate for the protection. So if we are, for instance, an Italian company, if we apply for protection only in Italy, anyone can perform that invention elsewhere. Of course, not entering again into the Italian market, but they can perform the invention elsewhere without paying you anything. Of course, they will be prevented, sorry, they will be prevented from patenting again the same invention due to that rule of novelty. From the point that you disclose your invention, and that will happen 18 months after your filing date, normally, from that time on, that subject matter cannot be object to any other patent application. It will be refused due to the lack of novelty. But nevertheless, if you do not apply for protection internationally, you can face the competition of other entities elsewhere, apart from the territory that you designated for protection. So, only in the countries that you apply for protection, you are entitled with that monopoly. So this is another very important thought, is that you clearly need to assess which are the territories that are important for you to have protection. So with regard to protection, we can use the European Patent Office patent application, which will allow you to extend your patent application to these 38 contracting states. So it's a very effective way of protecting inventions. And we have the other way of global protection, which is the Patent Cooperation Treaty. So this is a treaty from 1970. Nowadays ratified by 153 member states that allow you to extend the protection to this very wide range of countries. So in the end, patents make this very nice effort of rewarding the creation and to allow the returning of all the investment that we've done in order to obtain that invention. So this is a very important point, in fact, for us to have this way of, for a timely period, to have the chance to be the single ones in the market, or only the ones that we choose for that exploitation. So with regard to trademarks, that's something that we all know, because trademarks are everywhere around us. So as you know, we have trademarks everywhere. So this is a very common place for us. Then the protection of design. Here I have some examples of registered designs in the European Union. So very different objects, as you see here, which are protected with regard to design. And then we have copyright. So the second family of those IP rights. And copyright, in fact, has to do with all these very different things. We can talk about copyrights with regard to sculptures, music, literature, any kind of information, presentations, texts, writings, and so on, drawings, animation figures, photography, any dance choreographies, software, architecture, and so on. So these are the things that are normally linked with copyright. So copyright brings this idea of exclusivity to the use of works by the creator or by someone that is entitled by the creator with that right. Of course, it is only applicable to those ideas that are disclosed. So bringing back that previous slide where I mentioned that only the disclosure of the ideas is the time where and when we will have protection, and only then we'll have that protection. Then a very important point is that no registration is required at the EU for the protection of copyrights. The protection is granted by the law automatically from the moment when a work is created and disclosed by its creator. From the moment when that work goes out of the creator's mind and of his intimate circle. Okay, in that point, copyright is different from the IP rights because, as I told you, any IP right needs to be filed as a request near a public authority. Copyright, they don't need to be filed anywhere in order to exist as a right, and as a right that can be prosecuted under the law. Then there are some secondary points and aspects regarding copyright. One of them is that copyright brings this idea of economic and moral rights. Moral rights are all the rights related with authorship, with the right to secure the integrity of the work and the right of its disclosure. Moral rights normally are linked with the author, even if the economic rights, the copyright itself, seeing it economically, are transferred to a third party. For instance, when a writer makes and celebrates a contract for the edition of its work, of its book in a single country, of course, you will retain the moral rights with him. You'll only address and will only grant the right for another entity to exploit that book in a single market. The copyright protection is valid for the author's lifetime plus 70 years after its death. It's another point that when we see that the time span of the different rights are quite diverse. So briefly, if we look at all of them, we see that in this chart that we have different scope of protections We have different time spans linked with all these rights, as you see. The only right, the only IP right, which is potentially eternal, is the trademark, because as you see, in the majority of countries, it can be renewed every 10 years without any kind of limit. So every 10 years, we have the chance to renew your trademark registration without any time limit. So it's a very, very important thing. And as we see here, these are the different families of IP rights that we can use. So as a single example, and getting back again to that first slide, when we talk about ideas and the protection of ideas and the protection of different angles of one idea, we have here a mobile phone. And what we can see here is that we have several patent applications covering very different aspects, technical features which are embedded in this mobile phone. Then we can have the design protection of the external appearance of the mobile phone. Then a trademark. This case is not the most relevant one with regard to trademark because this brand is very, very well known worldwide. But if you think about any competitor of this one, you see that the trademark is always very, very visible. It's there, it is there to catch your attention. So it's very important, that part as well. And then we have copyright, and you can divide copyright here in two different areas. First of all, the first one is the operative system that runs this mobile phone. And this, of course, is protected by copyright. But then we have several pieces of copyright, which are each app that is embedded in this mobile phone. Each one of them has its own copyright associated with that work. So it can be negotiated, it can be object of trading separately. And this is another very important point. So, with regard to software, in Europe, the basic protection is granted by copyright. As I told you, the expression, the layout, the interface of the software, it is protected by copyright. So you don't need, in fact, to have any kind of registration in order to enforce your copyrights with regard to software. And of course, that protection is also linked with the source code on the other hand. But in fact, we can also have protection by patent applications when we think about the so-called computer implemented inventions. So those pieces of software, algorithms, and so on, that provide a given and proven technical effect, that cause a technical effect elsewhere. We'll have here a very short example to understand this point better. Then we have trademarks as a secondary but very powerful protection for a given software, especially when we think about software as a service solution, when we are quite far from the chance of applying for a patent application. Normally what we can do, and it's a very effective strategy, is to link a trademark with our software. Because in that sense, people will remember our software by its trademark. It's a very powerful way of getting the attention of people, even in those situations where someone will show up with an alternative software that performs the same operation. Because sometimes when you think about services, as you know, it's barely impossible to get a monopoly on a service, to get an exclusive right on a service. People will compete openly in the market. And one very effective strategy is for us to try to differentiate ourselves from other players using a trademark. Normally, when we think about the exploitation of software, licensing is the classic approach. So the owner of that software, and normally that owner is a company, will grant a right of use of that software. Do not sell the software by itself, because selling a software is a single business, is a single act that will, how can we say, it will empty our property if we sell something. Licensing is different. Licensing is a right of use, where we can define the terms of that use, but the property will remain with us, okay? But this is very important to understand that the classic trend for exploitation of software has to do with licensing deals. And every exploitation strategy, in fact, departs from the full IP ownership, from the full copyrights that are entitled by law, that are given by law to the creator or to a company where the creator is based in order to develop its software. So when we look at the different models with regard to licenses, we all know about that open source trend. But open source, when we think about IP and when we think about copyright, must be understood as a voluntary limitation of the rights that are granted by law to the developer of that software. In that sense, it is a freedom that he will exercise to disclose and to put that software at the disposal of third parties freely. And that freedom, of course, is something that is defined by some models, some contractual models, that in the majority of cases will still bring some restrictions to those users. So it is not equal to full freedom or improperly saying to some kind of jungle of or uncontrolled environment. Nothing to do with that. An open source license has limits as well. So when we travel to our left side of this chart, we see that in the end we'll have Sorry? Sorry?
I think someone connected, but I've muted him, so please proceed.
Okay. Okay. So getting back to our slide, this slide brings you the idea of the strategy that any software developer can take in order to exercise the rights on its own software. So it can, on one hand, it can turn that into almost public domain, so using those open source licenses. But it can take a very different strategy and bringing these proprietary licenses with all the restrictions that it will put into the agreement in order to have the majority of those rights reserved to him. Sorry. So, with regard to patents again, we have here an example. This is an example brought by a company, by a startup company, that is incubated in our incubator in Instituto Pedro Nunes, that has to do with software creations. This is a solution for enhancing the image of surgical probes that people use for surgical operations when we insert a camera and a surgical instrument into a patient's body, and the need for upgrading the images that are collected in real time. So this is the problem, of course. So enhancing and improving those images, this is the problem. And the solution is given by this company, which is called Perceive 3D. This is a company which is a spin-off company from our University of Coimbra that was created by a PhD from a full professor from our faculty. And it is a company which is an IP-intensive company because it is nowadays based in a very strong patent portfolio. So that one was the first patent application that was still applied by the university. And nowadays this company is developing their own patents, their own patent applications by themselves. So with regard to technology commercial exploitation and those very important points. The first one, when you are developing a project, when you are developing an innovative solution, as I say here, take care of your belongings. So keep very strict and close attention to every single information disclosure that you do of your assets. Because in that sense, as I told you, novelty, on one hand, sorry, novelty is the first requisite for patenting something. that invention must be novel in that date. So if you disclose it prior to that date, you will be in danger of not having a patent. On the other hand, people around us are eager to steal things from us if they foresee any kind of potential or value in our information. So sign NDAs, non-disclosure agreement, with people which are not part of your team. Every time you need to exchange information with them that you think it is critical. Secure your intangibles at every time. So this is our first advice. In any case, in any project, you need to assure that this will happen. Then a second advice, written agreements with each and every collaborator, partner, or project. Here we are thinking not only about people that are gathered in your team, in your research, in your innovative team, in your startup, but also in every single collaboration that you will need to set up in order to carry on with your project. Because as you know, the majority of times, these innovative projects, you will need to find for external resources, either for prototyping, for an opinion, for a technical feature that you don't have in your team. So anytime you need to talk with people outside your environment, you need to have a written agreement securing not only your IP, but also the information, as I told you in the first point. When we think about people, of course, we are all aware that nowadays people tend to rotate very quickly. People that are with you now in one year can be in another project. And you need to secure that the time that those guys spent with you in your project, all the IP that was generated with their collaboration will belong to you, your company, to your university, to your R&D center, whatever. In every case, you need to have a written agreement to secure this. Because nowadays people are with you, but tomorrow, sometimes they don't. They will be elsewhere. They can even be working with a competitor. Or maybe they can launch their own company. So you need to foresee these scenarios and bringing this to a written document in order to secure. Of course, this is only a paper, but it's a legally binding paper, in fact. And at least you can claim for some kind of compensation if someone behaves improperly. Third point, think about IP protection from day one. So think about IP as something that will follow your project and that you need to assess and reassess several times during the development of your project. Because sometimes there are things that need to be dealt in the beginning. Some of them will show up afterwards in the future. So you need to be attentive at any time of all the things that you need to do to secure your IP. Then, as we are talking about software, don't forget your sexy trademark. Create a sexy trademark. Create something that will distinguish you from the competitors and bring it to protection. Protect it, because that's a very, very powerful asset, especially when we think about software. Because as I told you, there are several cases of software products, software solutions, that the only protection that we can have with regard to IP is the trademark that is related with that project. And then in the end, assess all options for exploitation. License, selling your IP, and departing to other adventure. Joint venturing, sometimes linking your forces with the forces of other companies, with other people, in order to create a more developed product. Act as a supplier to the big players in the industry, for instance. Do not take the dream of being the number one in a certain industry, but being a premium provider to those big guys. That can be also a way of extracting value from your IP. Cross-licensing. Sometimes when we see some intellectual assets that are developed and protected by a third party, and that party will look to our IP rights and see some value on them. So you can have a cross-licensing deal. So giving reciprocal access to the rights of each other. Spin out, sometimes that can be another option. So if you have plenty of lines, plenty of products, plenty of R&D projects running at the same time, think about separating one of them and creating a separate company, a separate entity to exploit them. And of course, not to mention open source models. Sometimes they can also be a very nice way of getting into the market. Why not? But look at the open source as something which is a voluntary option from your side to open your assets to the community, and not as something which is imposed to you. Because in the beginning, you own your IP rights on your solution, on your software, for instance. If you opt to use an open source license model, that's because you intend that that's the best way for you to disclose and to get into the market with your solution. Otherwise, you will privilege the way of exploitation with a license, with a paid license, with a proprietary license, as I told you in the beginning. Then a very last point, which has to do with open science, as I told you. Sometimes when we think about especially EU-funded projects, there are some obligations in the grant agreement which is signed with the European Commission, those guys that will give us the money for us to develop the projects, in order to open the results of your project to the community. So bringing them to those open publications and so on. And this is a very intensive trend nowadays. So sharing of knowledge and so on. So my last remark will be that you need to carefully assess your obligations relating open science in that sense, with that point that I mentioned in the beginning, which has to do with the novelty that you need to assure if you want to patent something. So if you, anything that you put into the open science track prior to a patent application is condemned not to be a patent application, because it will lose the novel character immediately as soon as that publication is online, as soon as that publication is available to the public. In that point, that matter that you will disclose using those open science tools will lose its novelty, and in that sense, it will prevent you to have a patent. It will prevent you to have that monopoly. So take this into very deep consideration. All the things that you want to put into the open science track, and of course, taking into account those obligations that arise normally from the grant agreement, which is signed with the European Commission for those R&D funded projects, together with your possible strategy for patenting. Because anytime you enter into the open science track, it can be too late for you to have a patent afterwards. Thank you for your attention. This is the contents that I have. And of course, I am more than happy to open discussion with you and to have a Q&A period because we still have some time left. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jose. I don't know if anyone has any question for Jose.
This is Paolo.
Yes, hi Paolo.
The novelty is a requirement, but for a patent, but it is not a requirement for a trademark, or it is a requirement.
No. In fact, the requirement for a trademark protection is the availability of the sign that you want to protect. So, very old trademarks, for instance, if they were abandoned, so if the registration is lapsed, for instance, in one of those 10-year periods, if you do not renew it, it will cease protection, and someone can protect it again. So in that sense, you don't need to have novelty on a trademark to have a registration. You only need that trademark to be available and not to be likely to be confused with other trademarks which are registered for the same products or services. If we think about trademarks, there are several cases of very similar or sometimes the same trademark, for instance, the same word, which is in the market, making the distinction of very different objects. Okay? For instance,
Okay.
Dove, trademark Dove for soaps and for chocolates. It's an international trademark, I think. In other countries, we have those D-O-V-E trademark, Dove or Dove. That trademark is registered by two different players, two different companies for two different areas, because soaps are one thing and chocolates are another very different thing. And in that sense, they can coexist in the market because the consumer, the regular consumer, the Mr. Average, will not think that those products came from the same origin, from the same company. Because normally when we think about soap industry, we do not prefigure that those guys do chocolates in the same place. Okay, so this is the rationale. Availability and non-likelihood of confusion between our sign and the remaining signs for the same products and services. Is that clear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So if there isn't any other question, I think we can finish the webinar. Thank you, Jose, for the presentation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Ours too. So for those who want to have the presentation or the audio of the presentation, it will be available on EOSC website. So we'll put it there as soon as possible. And again, thank you for your attendance. Hope that you have all the success with EOSC project.
Yeah, those are my wishes too. This is a very interesting project and technical area. So I hope